Danny F. Doctor 9783222S 50K failed bet, and Camille.
Tony?
I'm here.
How's it going?
Was that again?
How are you doing today?
Pretty good. How about yourself?
Yeah, very well, thank you. So, what's bringing you to the server today? You were just listening in?
Yeah, I drop in to listen. I sometimes listen on the YouTube channel, but I decided to drop in on the Discord channel this morning.
Cool. So you obviously find the discussion somewhat interesting.
It depends. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't.
I mean, do you think flat earthers have any valid points that they're making, or any of the questions that we're asking? Do you think they're valid? Do you think they should be given time and discussed, or do you just think it's all ridiculous?
Oh, I discuss these quite a bit. I mean, after all, I wrote a book on flat Earth, so I think it's important to take the time to discuss these things.
Why do you think it is that in the mainstream and in the education system they're not really discussing it seriously and they're just kind of dismissing it?
Well, I think in the mainstream and in education, things are greatly simplified many times. You know, you flat earthers are right about some things. For instance, very few people were actually convinced of the Earth's being a sphere. They were simply told that when they were very young, and that does sort of amount to indoctrination. My teaching over the years, I would ask students, you know, if they believe the Earth. This goes back more than 10 years ago now. Ask them if what shape the Earth is, and they'd agree that it was spherical. And then I'd ask them, well, okay, can you give me some evidence of that? And I rarely could find a student who could give me a good argument. I mean, really, they could not. Doesn't mean that they're wrong about the Earth shape. It simply means that they were never really educated. And education's like that, unfortunately. You take the shortcuts so many times, and people, and even today when I talk to people, they find out I investigate the flat Earth movement and write about it and speak about it, and they just kind of roll their eyes and they say, these are friends of mine, by the way, and they say, well, that's so stupid. I said, well, hold on a minute. Can you give me 3 arguments for the Earth being a globe? And my friends generally can't. So
yeah, so you've been out there flat marking longer than most people here have.
Well, sort of, except I don't steer them that direction. But I want to get them to think about these things. And unfortunately, much of education doesn't really foster thinking. And when my years of education, I was not so much concerned with giving my students information that I think is true. More important to me is how we know things to be so. That's what true education is all about, really.
Yeah. So I find it interesting, and I wonder what your perception is of why you think it is that the education system is teaching.
What?
I find it interesting, like you say, that the education system seems to be indoctrinating this belief in children that the Earth is a globe, but not really equipping them to be able to actually give any coherent reason or evidence for that when they're asked the question. Why do you think it is that the education system is operating in that way?
It's not just on that front, it's in all sorts of things.
I would agree with that.
We like to, education unfortunately is about memorization, rote things. History, for instance, is dates and names and places, but there's very little of taking that information and putting it together to figure out things, because that's hard to do. It really is. It's hard to instill that in students. Number one, they have to be really interested and be motivated in it. And if they're not interested, they're not going to want to think through it. So it's like pushing a string. It cannot be done. And so education is proper education is a very difficult arduous thing to do, and very few people are good at it or successful at it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The education systems, mainly, at least in the West anyway, the ones I've experienced, they seem to be teaching kids what to think, but not how to think.
Yep, you got
And
that. By the way, where are you from? Where do you live?
I'm in Scotland,
Okay, all right.
which used to be the home of some of the best education in the entire world, right? It's famous
I
for
understand. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
creation of the modern world, and the education system now has to be a far cry from what it used to be. So I find it interesting, and as a man who's in the education field, I think it would be interesting just to get your take on that, because I think there are a number of things that we actually agree on. I mean, what you're saying about the education system is pretty much exactly how I see it, not working in the academic field, but I know academics, I know teachers, I have friends who work in these fields. So I have this concern as well. I understand that you accept that there's a creator. I mean, that's another one, right? I mean, you must see. Do you not see a parallel between how they teach, or in the mainstream schooling, not religious schooling, but secular state schooling? Do you not see a parallel in how they treat something like religion to how they treat something like flat Earth, like in terms of not really having open, rigorous dialogue and discussion about it in earnest and respect, but kind of shoving it to the side or teaching it in a way that might implicitly sway you to another side without giving a fair airing of the other side? If you know what I mean.
I see your point, but I think it's a little different. I think there's a little more respect given to religion than to flat Earth. I think it,
Yeah, I would agree with that.
and it's I think anymore it's the idea is that we don't want to indoctrinate kids in religion, and so public education tends to avoid it. Now, it hasn't always been the case in my country. That was a part of education at one time, even public education.
Would you not say now that the public education is swayed more towards promoting an atheistic secular worldview, even if just implicitly?
Yeah, I think it's not necessarily intentional on the part of people, but in this country, people have come to accept this notion of separation of church and state, which is not part of our Constitution, though many people think that it is. And so in my lifetime, there's been a continual movement to push any kind of discussion of religion out of the schools and any consideration of God. Not that it's necessarily anti-God. It's just they want to be neutral, and that neutrality ends up in not discussing it at all. And that's really quite a lapse.
Yeah. So yeah, I could see that. I mean, that's it. Like, and that's what I mean when I say it's almost implicit and it's subtle in the way that it's conditioning a lot of people, I would say, to at least not think about it, to have it not be present. And then when they don't think about it, it's like, well, obviously I'm not going to start thinking about a creator or how I should orient my life with that belief if I'm not thinking about it. And schools are telling you, hey, we're telling you the things that you should be thinking about, that you should be acting on, how you should be behaving. So, yeah, I just think it's interesting that that's no longer really a part of the education. And that's an interesting point that you made about the separation of church and state not being a part of the Constitution, because you're right, that's a very heavily entrenched modern feature of modern democracies. They say that, the separation of church and state, that's how we keep it legit. But maybe there's some pitfalls to that.
Definitely, definitely.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. So how do you teach students to think about the question of how they can discern the truth about Earth and what Earth might be?
Well, again, I've been away from the classroom for a decade now, but
Yeah.
I would share with them a little bit of the history of that. I would, one thing I had to deal with was what I call the Columbus myth, that everybody thought the world was flat until the time of Columbus, and Columbus showed otherwise, and if you really analyze that myth, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The Columbus sailed from Spain to the Caribbean and back again, and he did it 3 more times. And I asked the question, how does that tell you anything about the Earth's shape? And, and it really doesn't. So the story doesn't even make any sense. That story was created in the 19th century, and there's a long history as to how and why that came about. There's an evolutionary connection to that, believe it or not. So it's
That doesn't
interesting.
surprise me.
And we were, I was raised up with that. I was probably in high school when I found out on my own reading, the true story of that. And I've had to battle with that with my students at the university. I would encounter that most of them believe the Columbus myth, and I don't know if it's getting any better today. Maybe there's certainly opportunity for people to properly teach that. But I had to deal with that. And if people are really bought into the Columbus myth, then you have to unteach them a lot of things before you can teach them. I've found that there are a lot of misconceptions that students have with what might do. Most students don't understand the causes of the lunar phases. They don't understand the true cause of the seasons. And I found that I had to burn to the ground what they thought before I could rebuild it, because otherwise you're giving them contradictory information. You have to unconvince them or unlearn them of what they've already learned, and then turn around and then teach them right. And some of the students really appreciated that, but some other students, just barely engaged at all. And I don't think they really got it, and that's sad.
Yeah, that's kind of what we experience here. It is a case of trying to cut through a lot of, like we said, the indoctrination and the stories that were told, like Columbus. That's a good example. And again, to me, that's another example of a pseudoscience or just pure mythos, as you're saying, being pushed in a way that's really tangibly affecting these kids' reality. Like the same way that the Columbus is used.
I'm sorry, you're breaking up. I can't hear what you're saying. Have we lost you?
Yeah, I'm in a tunnel. I'm under a river.
All right.
Sorry, give me 2 minutes.
That's fine.
All right, maybe I'm back. Okay, I think I'm back to surface level now.
I can hear you just fine now.
Okay, that's fine. The satellites have got me back. So I was saying that it would also make me think of Piltdown Man, right? And how that was in the textbooks for 50 years, and a generation or two of kids came up almost being convinced of the claim of Darwinian evolution because of a hoax. In a similar way that
another one is the way they portray Neanderthals. They were shown as being stoop-shouldered and knuckle draggers, and that persisted even longer than the Piltdown hoax did in the literature and education.
And it still goes on. I mean, this caricature of cavemen and Neanderthals is still what 90+% of people think when it comes to how they're classifying old remains of humans. And then the people who are actually studying them are saying no, they'd be pretty much indistinguishable from modern humans. The differences are not really any greater than racial differences that we see today in humans.
Yeah. Well, getting back to my experience in the classroom, when I taught my astronomy classes, when I would do my tests, I give about 3 or 4 tests a semester, and I would hand out blue books. I don't know if you have those in the UK, but these are little booklets with about 16 pages in it that are blank, that you can give these out, and that nobody has any notes written down or anything on them. And then I give them a sheet of paper with 10 questions on it, and the 10 questions would be, I'd ask them to explain things, and my students, very few of them, in fact, I'd say almost none of them had ever taken a test like that. Most of the tests they'd ever taken were matching, fill in the blank, true and false, sort of things that are easiest to grade, even a machine readable stuff. And I had particularly older students, that very bright students, that never encountered a test like that, and they were just used to memorizing. And when they went into my test, they were just blown away because they weren't used to doing that. And my test required that you do some thinking. It wasn't a matter of just memorizing facts and figures.
Yeah, exactly. And I would be curious to know, in your experience, if you think you've noticed a decline, let's say, in cognitive ability over the years, or if you haven't, or if you think it's always been the same since you've been doing it. But I agree with you. That's like we're saying. I mean, it doesn't feel like the education system is teaching people to think. It's just like it's almost dumbing them down. I mean, I don't know what your view on some kind of concerted effort one way or another to not make the population smart, let's say, but to make them quite uninformed, gullible, naive, whatever you want to say. What would you say? Do you think you've noticed a trend or any change in the cognitive abilities of people generally? And do you pay any mind to the idea that there's potentially some kind of intent behind a decline?
I
Or
can't say direct experience, but I can look at textbooks. There was a classic astronomy textbook from the 60s that I still keep as a reference. And that was a standard textbook used 50, 60 years ago in college introductory astronomy classes. And it has some algebra and trig in it. It has all these other concepts that if you tried to use that textbook today, it would be a disaster. I think we've watered down everything, and I don't think it's malevolent so much as it is due to something else. We've become very egalitarian about education. When I was young, not everybody went to college. I was kind of surprised when I learned, I think in fifth grade, when our teacher told us that many of us would not go to college, and she was right. But that's changed. Who doesn't go to college anymore? In the United States, you could wasn't that long ago, if you wanted to be a policeman or go into law enforcement, you simply had to have a high school diploma, have a clean record, and you would go once you're accepted, you go to police academy. They teach you what you needed to know. Now, very few police departments in this country will hire a person unless they have a college degree in criminal justice. And it's not clear to me that you've really taught them much more than they knew before. In order to get everybody to go to college, we have to water down the curriculum. Back 200 years ago, education was quite different because people were taught to read and write, and that was about it. And if you had the ability and the finances to go on beyond that, then your education was very much in depth, very incredibly far beyond what we have today. But we just encourage everybody to go to school today, and that's I think that's the big problem.
yeah, I would agree with that. That's another thing I say to a lot of people that I meet and I speak to in Scotland, younger people coming up talking about going to uni. Really now, it's swung the other way to the point where there's so many degrees, their value in the work space and reality generally has kind of declined, and you're almost better just going into a trade and getting a trade. Like most people would probably do better in life with a practical trade. But no, that's interesting. I mean, I suppose we'd maybe differ slightly on why we think that's occurring, but I definitely think there's been a decline in, I mean, you can look at, I don't know if you've seen any of like the exam papers from the early 1900s. I mean, there's, in the UK we had a thing called O-levels, which would be like, I guess when you're, let me think, 14, 15, 16, and you're doing high school, like higher end high school tests. And you can see exam papers from O-levels in like the earlier 1900s. And the level of it is like university level today, easily. And these were kids in the 1900s. Like the maths they're doing, the literature questions that they're getting, geography, history, the depth of the questions, the length of the questions, the answers that would be expected, all of it just way higher level than what we see today. And I suppose I'm interested in what you would think the shift for that is, because to me it's resulted in a lower cognitive ability generally of people to think, like we're saying earlier, like you're taught what to think rather than how to think. I'm
Yeah,
curious to why you think that's occurring. And
yeah, that's what I was getting at with the textbook comparison from 50, 60 years ago. The
yeah,
material that incoming freshmen in the university were expected to know has dropped and dropped and dropped. The shift really began in earnest in the 60s in this country. Looking back, the things they were doing is, again, encouraging more and more people to go to college and opening the doors to everybody. Not everybody should do that. People, and in this country, we're seeing more of almost a subculture of people who are going into trades rather than going to college. I don't know. I'm a little concerned about the direction that's going, but again, I think it's the egalitarian approach we have today to education. Everybody should go to school.
so I'm curious, like, why you think that change is happening specifically. Like you say, like a guy in the 60s reading the textbook was expected to know far more than someone who's coming in today. Why is it, do you think? Do you think it's just because they want to lower the bar so that more people will be in education to like pay fees and stuff like that? Is that kind of what you think, or?
No, I think it's a belief that education is a very positive force for good in society, and this gets into what I would political philosophy, liberals and conservatism. Liberals believe very much in education. If you have people who do bad things, well, it's because they've not been educated. And the education in this country, at least, is always touted as being the solution to so many problems. So, if you really believe that, then the way to improve the world is to educate the daylights out of everybody. But in order to do that, you're going to be bringing in people who really shouldn't be in school in the first place, perhaps. And the only way you can get them through that is to lower the bar. When I was growing up, going to college required maybe 1 or 2 units of science from high school. University, say university. We say college here. You say university in the UK, probably. But over the years, they've wanted to improve education. So many states now require 3 and 4 science courses in high school before you go to university. And in the past, that would have meant taking, say, physical science in 9th grade, biology in 10th, chemistry, and then physics in your junior and senior years. But the problem is, those are very mathematically inclined, very analytical things that not everybody can really do. So the solution has been to lower the bar so that it's not taught at the level it once was, because you're letting in people who really don't need to be there, and it's to the detriment of people who do, and they're not getting the education that they were supposed to have.
Yeah, but see, to me that just seems so crazy, because, like you say, if the thing is that everyone's appreciating or believing that education is the most important thing, like being intellectually informed and cognitively able is of paramount importance, then how can it be that it's progressed to a point where everyone's less cognitively able? And so, I mean, I get what you're kind of saying is that, well, in their drive to educate as many people as possible, because education's so important, they've essentially lowered the bar to get everyone involved. But surely it's a little bit counterintuitive to think that these people genuinely want the best educated society, but in doing so, somehow they've made everyone less cognitively able, and they've lowered the standards of the education to the point where people aren't as cognitively able. Like, to me, well, that would either be gross incompetence or a more concerted effort not to actually improve people's educations, but to make them more susceptible to being hoodwinked, maybe by the more educated. Like, do you not think that the idea that they're really after the best education for everyone is kind of contradicted by what we're talking about? The fact that the education system now is not educating and not creating cognitive strength, but essentially susceptibility to indoctrination.
Yeah, the mistake twofold. Number one is they assume that education is the salvation of society. It's not. But when once they began down that road, then they focus on educating everybody, and they don't intentionally perhaps go about cutting corners, but that's exactly what they end up doing. We used to have teachers colleges, teachers universities in this country. We don't have anymore, I don't think. And they they really did a good job of preparing the teachers to teach. The school district I grew up in would shop to get their teachers from one of these schools particularly. And I think looking back, I had some pretty good teachers when I was growing up. But those teachers colleges wanted to be something better, quote unquote, and now they're full-fledged universities, and teaching is no longer really emphasized. And when I say the teaching, I'm not talking about the methodology courses. One of the problems I think we have in education today is that education majors are heavy on supposed courses on how to be a teacher, how to teach, and so forth, but very short on content. I think if you're a history ed teacher, you know quite a bit less history than a history ed teacher did 50 years ago. And if you're science ed, you know quite a bit less science than the science ed teachers majors from 50 years ago. And it's because people are so committed to education, they think that if you work on the pedagogy, how to teach, that will make better teachers. And I disagree with that. I think one of the key things you need to do is get the people you're wanting to teach very knowledgeable in the subjects they're supposed to teach. And that's, I mean, it's very subtle and it's very insidious, and very few people can see the problem there.
Yeah, and I mean, well, I would just, I mean, I agree with you on the teaching side as well. It's like with the general decline in the education, obviously the teachers are themselves falling victim to that system of basically indoctrination rather than education. Like the teachers are being taught in a similar way to the students in terms of how to teach, and it's all kind of stopping teaching to be valuable, which is philosophical and challenging, and not just regurgitating information out of a textbook. But to me, it's hard for me to give, say, the government and education systems the benefit of the doubt and say, well, they're trying their best, but they just so happen to be creating worse teachers, worse education systems, and thus worse students and less cognitively able people, even though what they're really trying to do is improve everyone's education. Because it's a sad indictment of the entire education system, like what we've agreed on already. But I suppose we differ in that I couldn't give the benefit of the doubt to these people and say that it's just been a happenstance of tumbling to the point where policies have ruined people's brains in a pretty large and part way, and they're not actually teaching them stuff. They're indoctrinating them with stories about Columbus and Piltdown Man and all this kind of thing. Like, do you not think it's possible that there's potentially some nefarious intent with what they're doing with the education system to make a society that isn't as cognitively able to think for itself, so that it might be more susceptible to, say, suggestion from the state or straight up indoctrination from the state?
No, I think it's more of a flawed of philosophy of what education ought to be, and a very poor execution of the policy they did have. I mean, it's a flawed on both ends, the foundation of what they're trying to do and how they get there. It's people can argue with other factors like television and what was coming down the pike, and now the internet and so forth, and those may be playing a role as well. Students do have incredibly short attention spans now, and that's a real problem.
I mean, isn't that crazy? I mean, what media and internet has done to kids' brains. I mean, I speak to teachers all the time, and they're coming in being like, the kids can't sit still for 5 minutes. They can't read a book. They can't do sums. And it's like, yeah, no shit. They're playing something like Call of Duty, or they're in a virtual reality before they have breakfast. They're getting PTSD before they come to school. They're like fighting a almost photorealistic wartime battle in the streets of Baghdad before they even come to school. And then we're surprised when they can't sit still and do their sums in school. So again, this is what I mean. Like, Are you saying that you think it's just accidental that we're ruining kids' brains?
Yeah, I don't necessarily think there's a people behind a big plot to make everybody stupid, as it were. Is a harsh word, I guess, but it really is a number of factors coming together. But the attention span's a real problem because people don't read like they used to, and reading's really important. I know young people who have never read a book in their lives. I just I'll back up a second. They've never read a book that wasn't assigned to read, and even then, they didn't read the book many times. My
Yeah.
students, over the years, anyway, I always had a textbook to go with my courses, and early on in my teaching career, people would buy the textbook, but after a while, it got to the point many of my students just wouldn't buy the textbook, and I was flabbergasted. That really came to my notice 15 or 20 years ago, probably about 20 years ago. They just thought a textbook was optional. And I, pick up the textbook to show them something in the book, refer to something in the book, and very few of them had a book. And I thought, wait a minute.
Yeah.
When I started at university a half century ago, I went out and I saw the book list I needed, and I went out and I bought those books. I bought some of them new in the bookstore because they were a new edition, but then I scrounged for buying used textbooks to save a little bit of money.
Yeah,
On
that was
some
the same as me. That was the same as me. You're hunting around. I mean, these are law textbooks as well that I was looking for, and some of those are expensive as hell. So
Yeah,
I was
and
scrambling around for all the ratty old textbooks I could find.
it never occurred to me that these textbooks were just recommendations or optional. I'm just taken aback by that, and I think it's part of the fact that people don't read anymore. Having discussions, I do a little. There's one discussion group I belong to with globe earthers and flat earthers in it, and many times I would post something and describe something, or I would link one of my articles that I've written, and people would ask me, "Well, could you make a video about that?" And I thought, well, no, I wrote something about that. Why would I make a video? And I think so many people today, they don't want to read. They want to watch a video, and that's the last place I'll go. If I want to learn how to make a home repair, I get really annoyed when I go online trying to find it because they have plenty of videos to show me how, but I have a hard time finding a description of directions written down of what I need to do. That's a problem.
It's like they've conditioned lazy brain into people. And whether or not it's intentional or accidental, I mean, I can't give a benefit of the doubt that this is all just one blunder after another and philosophical positions that have led to this. Because, I mean, if you as an educator can recognize those issues, obviously the people in the education system who are deciding how it works know that those issues are issues, and the cognitive decline, maybe the IQ decline. I don't know. Like you say, it's hard to put a phrase on what it is that's happening, but it's certainly a decrease compared to what it was years ago. Like, it's been going on now for so long, and there's no real talk of it in the mainstream that I can see. Like, people aren't really. I mean, they are talking about the education system, but not in a real way like, okay, this is totally messed up. Everyone's now got way lower attainment than they used to. What is it that we're doing here? How can we address it? The fact that that's not happening is another reason that I find it hard to imagine that this is all just accidental and based on a philosophical position. Because if it's the philosophical position mainly, then why has that not been challenged and addressed by the education system? Saying, well, we're getting lower attainment here. People don't know what the hell they're doing. They don't even know they have to buy textbooks anymore. What are we doing? Like, you must be quite jaded or skeptical of the education system at this point, if you agree with what we're saying.
Yeah, the education system is a mess, and there's not an easy fix. It was a series of poor decisions and poor executions going over decades. And it's not a good thing. There are many different factors. I have a cousin of mine who has a EDD, and she got that back in the '60s. She's up and quite elderly now, and She is became disenchanted with the educational establishment a long time ago, and she was pretty committed to education, going all the way to get an EDD. And a few years ago at a family reunion, I asked her. She told me I know exactly when education really shifted in this country. I said, when was that? What was the event? It was like 1968 or so. She was present. She was pretty new at that point, but she was a member of the National Education Association, NEA, and it had been a professional society. And in 1967, 68, somewhere around there, they voted at their general annual meeting to become a union. And she thought at the time this is a very bad idea, and it's been downhill ever since. And she really
Could you
pegs
say
me
that?
back.
Could you say that quickly again? I just missed what it was that you said. 1968. What was it that happened?
She said the NEA convention, they had a debate and then decided to switch from being a professional society to be a labor union. They suddenly
Oh,
became, from white collar to blue collar. They didn't realize that. They thought they were still white collar, but she said that changed everything. The NEA completely revamped at that point, and that changed the educational outlook in this country tremendously by becoming a union. And the NEA is really a bad organization today. I've been to one of their conventions before, and it's pretty bad actually.
so would
So
you say that's maybe equivalent to something like the Law Society or an architectural society or engineering society where they have standards and procedures that the body's largely focused on, as opposed to something like a trade union where it's more about employment for employee welfare and, not necessarily the technical acumen that you might need for that
you
profession or
you
industry.
you have it exactly right. It switched, and that really changed the profession in this country. It goes back to the late '60s, and it really did change everything in the classroom. And the people at the time making that decision, they thought it was a good move, but my cousin, thought it was a terrible move. And she, over the decades that she worked in education, saw it get worse and worse. And she pegs it back to that. That's to her, that was the major thing that changed everything. Now I'm talking about here about primary and secondary education. At the university level, it's quite a bit different.
No, that's interesting. I've not heard about that transition. I don't know if a similar thing happened in the UK, but yeah, that's interesting if it's the case that teachers previously were held to like an industry level standard that was maybe quite strict in the way that architects, engineers, and things are today, and they shifted off that standard at a certain point. That would make some sense. But then I would be curious, what was the drive behind that change? Who was responsible for that? Who ultimately made that decision? And if your cousin had any thoughts on that, or if you got into that kind of thing.
Well, the NEA is open to any school teacher in the country, of primary and secondary ed, and they have representatives that go to the annual convention usually at the beginning of July, and they make a lot of decisions. They vote on things, and so it was a motion from the members of the NEA themselves, the teachers themselves, to
They
make
all
that.
voted on it, and that's kind of how
Mhm.
they made the decision.
Yep.
And
They made
does that
decisions.
organization have, or did it have any government oversight, or was it entirely independent of the government at that time?
Oh, it's entirely independent. Unions are in this country independent, and professional societies are. But to me, that's unthinkable, because I think of teachers as being a profession, not an employment. I mean, you're not a
Yeah.
laborer in that sense, like a trade, and it makes no sense for them to do that. And you mentioned engineers and other people. They're professionals, and teachers. That it really changed the attitude of who they were, what they were doing, and how they were supposed to do it. And it reflected a lot of the shifting things going on in the 1960s. So that was a huge thing, that part of the mix that transformed education in this country.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. So, I mean, again, it's like, to me, and actually, Adam Unsalted made a good little point in the chat there,
What do you say?
saying, well, if he was saying if it was a case of almost accidentally blundering our way into bad education, you would think that they would get it right as often as they do wrong, even just by chance. But it seems like it's just one blunder after another.
Yeah. Well, things have gotten worse to the point that it chases off really competent teachers, and I've had this conversation over the decades with people who went into education very much motivated to make a difference, to impact the lives of young people. And if they're really competent, really good, they get there and they find out just how bad things are and how incompetent their coworkers are, and eventually they get discouraged and leave. And so this whole shift in policy and attitude in the educational establishment has driven away good teachers to the point that really good people don't even go in the profession anymore. I think it was Thomas Sowell.
Exactly.
I think 30 years ago, Thomas Sowell, who was a editorial writer in this country, very conservative, he referred to the education schools at various universities across the country as the intellectual ghetto. And it's largely true. It tends to collect the people who can't really do anything else. It's been taking off on was it Socrates? Those who can do, those uh, who can't teach. So
Yeah. No, that's
and
interesting. I hadn't heard that soul quote before, but that's the intellectual ghetto. I like that.
uh,
And I mean, yeah, and the point about the quality of teachers and making the profession attractive, I agree. It's like it is one of the most important roles in our society, right? The upbringing and the education of the upcoming generations who are soon going to be in our position is the most and is one of the most important roles in society. But the teaching profession does not reflect that. Not just in the United States, but probably in most countries now, certainly in the UK. It's not an attractive profession for a lot of people. It's not
no,
especially well paid. It's
and
not especially respected or treated with any kind of reverence. It's like, it's kind of, and I mean, the class sizes increase and the children get potentially more unruly. So it's not an attractive profession to a lot of people. Whereas if you were a society or a state that genuinely cared about education being as high quality as it could be, you would think that it would be pretty simple and obvious to say, well, we need to make the teachers as good as they can be, and therefore we need to make the profession as attractive as it can be, and not just like, well, if you don't know what else to do, why don't you just become a teacher and teach the next kind of generation, so they won't know what the hell to do either.
yeah. I'll share a little anecdote here. I went back to the years ago. Went back to the town I grew up in, and they had a evening, had a festival going on downtown. Closed the total block off so from traffic, so people can set up displays and tables and booths and so forth. And I stood there with my wife and one of her cousins, and I looked across the street and I saw a tent there with four, I think about five people standing around, and I couldn't see what they were representing, but I looked at them and I said, you know what? Looking at their expressions on their faces, they look clueless. They really did. And I said, I bet anything those are representatives of the school teachers in the city. And sure enough, I went over there and got closer, and they were. Just from what they look like, I could figure that out. And my teachers growing up in that same town weren't like that. They really were competent people. I thought, I think they really knew what they were doing. Maybe I was clueless and didn't get it, but I think I got a reasonably good education there growing up. But it has really gone downhill, and there are many factors. But I think public education, at least in this country, was flawed from the beginning. I don't know when public education started in the UK, but early in this my country's history, any education was typically done uh, from churches. And about 150 years ago, there was a move put forward to start schooling and make publicly funding, and the whole drive behind that was to improve society and make better citizens of our people. The idea again that education is the key to solving any problem that we have. And again, I think that's a flawed concept. I don't agree with that at all. Education is a fairly neutral thing. It can be for good, it can be for bad. It's what you're teaching that makes the difference, all the difference in the world. And from the very get-go, they had the wrong foundation for what they wanted to do. and that thing has just continued to grow and grow and grow. And today, people in education really want to change the world, but not in the ways that they originally wanted to a long time ago, or even how I would think it. Now there's a lot of political correctness that goes on. People may get upset with me here, but there's a big push for the LBTQ whatever thing going on in schools today because they want to make a difference and they want to mold the citizens a particular way. And that is, if you will, a conspiracy, I suppose. They mean well. They're not trying to destroy society, but just because you mean well doesn't mean that you're doing good or doing in all of this. It's been said the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess maybe you have a little more optimistic a view of people than I do, because I don't necessarily see that they're meaning well for people with what's going on. I mean, how can you accidentally degrade the quality of textbooks?
You know, I'm sure that Adolf Hitler thought he was doing good. He wasn't. He didn't say, "Well, I want to find out what evil is, and I want to embody that and triumph that all over the world." He really believed in what he was doing, and thought it was best for mankind that he do that. Now, of course, it was totally wrong, and it was quite evil, but he wasn't consciously in trying to embrace evil. He was trying to do what is good, and so people many times can truly intend to help people, help society, but because of the wrong worldview they have, they can promote a lot of very bad things, very evil things. So yeah, I'm not saying that these people are good. I'm simply saying they haven't good intentions, but that's about as far as it goes.
I guess, yeah. I mean, I can. Well, I mean, you can't really see one personal entity necessarily, but to me it seems like the the weight of the organization is being moved in a way that's not conducive to an educated. I can't believe that that's just accidentalism, so to speak. But yeah, I guess we'll have a different take on how that comes to be. Have I dropped out?
Yeah, I can still hear you. I'm
Okay.
just I'm just eating my breakfast, and I keep going on mute so you don't hear me crunching on my food.
Oh, okay, no worries. Well, feel free to just go on mute and eat your breakfast. I don't want to make you starve. And if
I
there's
mean,
anyone else in the chat that wants to jump in on anything, feel free.
What is your profession?
See, old friend, I brought more soldiers than you did.